another loss by a federal judge. Good morning, Aaron.
Well, good morning. This was an interesting day in court, just for the optics, if we can use the word, because you had 9 lawyers from the ACLU and other advocacy groups against 2 guys from the Justice Department who were sent up from Washington, prosecutors from Brooklyn who were still working for the U.S. attorney appointed by President Obama, weren't even present to try and defend the president's immigration order, and the judge really wanted to hear, what needed to be done, how this was going to proceed, and eventually she did 2 things. One, she extended the emergency order that was in place on Saturday that prevents anyone being detained at airports from being immediately sent back on a plane. The government said there are no detainees at airports any longer, but the ACLU wasn't convinced, and so the judge told the government that they should probably get a list together of who is still being detained, who has been detained, who has been removed, and the government lawyers weren't even sure such a list existed.
So again, I ask you again, because I know this is very convoluted. Is the government holding anybody? If they're not allowed to go back and they're not allowed to come in, it's almost like the Tom Hanks movie Terminal, where they're living in the terminal.
Well, and the government says right now there is no one being held at an airport. At this point, anybody who's being prevented from coming to the country is being stopped overseas and may still be in limbo, but at least in limbo overseas and not in an American airport. And this particular case doesn't help any of those people. This only applies to people who are already here. The ACLU says it has anecdotal evidence that there are people being held in airports still, and people being stopped improperly, and people, even after the judge's order went into effect Saturday night, who were sent back on a plane unlawfully. In fact, they told one story of ACLU lawyers waiving a copy of the judge's order on Saturday night in front of Customs and Border Protection agents at JFK, and they had to turn a plane around on the tarmac, prevent it from taking off, so that somebody who was being shipped back to the Ukraine could end up deplaning and getting admission into the U.S. So it still seems like it's a rather confusing situation that has yet to fully play out legally, because now there are challenges. There's one today in Boston, there's one today in Washington State that start to get at the larger constitutional questions. Okay,
Aaron Katersky, what happened to that guy who was going to go back to the Ukraine, and what happened to that interpreter who was working with the soldiers in Iraq that they said was detained? Where are they? Are they being held? Or they didn't go back, but they're not being held, so they're just walking around as normal people as they would normally here in America?
They both have been admitted to the country, and the lawyer for the Iraqi interpreter, Habib Darwish, did not want his location disclosed. He didn't want the public knowing where he is, so he wouldn't tell us specifically where he is, but he was granted admission as he was eligible for, and so he's been admitted. And this has happened, but we've heard it was the process to get them in that the ACLU takes issue with, and they say that the continuing effect of the executive order is going to linger absent any further court action, because there still seems to be haphazard application. Green card holders, legal permanent residents, still a lot of clarity to come.
So the ACLU is still not convinced the government isn't holding anybody. How does the government prove they're not holding anybody? That's an awful weird thing to prove.
It is a weird thing to prove, and we're not sure how they're going to do it, but the ACLU is demanding a list of everyone who had been detained or removed since Saturday, and they want it updated on a daily basis. And we'll see if the government ends up providing it, or whether the court is going to have to order them to provide it, whether the court will go that far, and how well these constitutional challenges hold up. At minimum, the Justice Department has filed one document to give us a sense of how they're going to defend the case. They're going to suggest that a lot of these cases are moot because they are not holding anybody. They're also going to suggest that all of these groups have no standing to sue the federal government, and they're going to argue that the president cannot be second-guessed on matters of immigration and foreign policy. And so they stick to these rather mundane points of law conspicuously avoiding any rhetoric about justification for this, whether it's a Muslim ban, all that, all the juicy stuff.
Right.
That they're not going to bother with that.
Aaron, where does it go from here? There's a lot of courts, there's a lot of states, there's a lot of rulings. How is this going to work its way, and what court is going to ultimately decide this, and how long?
That is a great question, and that's what lawyers still aren't sure. At some point, you would think that the Justice Department is not going to want to have to defend the executive order in the multitude of courts they're in now. I think it's 8 different federal courts have cases involving the executive order. So the government, once the Justice Department is fully involved, and maybe once Jeff Sessions is confirmed, could well want to try and consolidate the cases. I think the ACLU is probably content to take its chances in different courts to see how different judges are willing to rule. And then eventually the suspicion is this may end up in front of the Supreme Court. But that could be a ways down the road. Aaron
Katersky, ABC News correspondent in New York with the latest. Aaron, thanks for checking in.
Enjoy your Super Bowl weekend.
Enjoy your Super Bowl weekend, you Patriot-loving fan, you. All right, thanks, Aaron.
I've been called worse.
By me, too, actually.
Yes, indeed.
All right, 728, Big 550.